When it comes to agentic coding, there's two main strategies that I've been using all the time on my day-to-day work job and also on my side projects and stuff that I do on my YouTube channel, right? So depending on the complexity of the project and the scope of the work, I have found that most work is either very deterministic, like you understand all the requirements, or it's something that lies more in experimentation and uncertainty, right? So I'm going to put two labels up here. I'm going to say well-known requirements will be on the left, and I will say uncertain requirements will be on the right. Now on this spectrum, when something is uncertain, like you don't really know what the requirements are, this is typically when you're experimenting. And a good example of this is if you're building out a game. So over here, this is my multiplayer game that I've been working on my channel once in a while. And a lot of the times I don't really know where I want to take this game. I'm not a game designer. I don't really have like a game design plan that lays out exactly how everything should work. I basically want to add in a feature. I want to test it out and play test it. And if I don't like it, I'll just go ahead and git stash that, or I'll reprompt it to tweak it and make it better. This is a great example of uncertain requirements where you can still use agentic coding to prompt and add in things, but you just don't want to sit there and spend hours trying to write out a plan because you're not really sure if that plan is going to satisfy the user's requirements. And this is also visible in web development. You're building out a web application. You're not really sure how the UI should work. Maybe you want to use cards. Maybe you need a table. Maybe you need certain type of sorting. These are things that you're not really sure about. And you can use a plan to basically build out the initial iteration. But I found that when stuff is uncertain, like building out games or just you're building out some novel type of application, prototyping, experimentation, games, going off vibes, I guess you could say. These are things that are very common probably in startup companies where you're not really sure what you're building. You just know that you need to make something usable and enjoyable for a user and solve their problem. And it's something that hasn't been built before, right? You can't just go and clone an existing application or existing game because yours is actually a little bit different. And so this is where uncertain requirements come into play. Now, in terms of well-known requirements, let's say that you need to build out application that handles insurance, right? This is a well-known domain. There's a bunch of different insurance companies who already have systems in place that do this. And so typically you have someone who has a lot of domain experience or domain knowledge who can really sit down and define well-defined user stories. So a user story is basically like a requirement or document that says, hey, this is what the feature needs to do for this user. Here are the post conditions. This is what happens after they do the action. Now, this can also include technical requirements. Like let's say that someone comes to you and say, hey, I know that this is going to have 100,000 users a second hitting this endpoint, right? So usage requirements, like I say, data set requirements. Sometimes you'll be told to do something and they don't really tell you, okay, how large is the data? And then you start building it out and you realize, oh, you're actually dealing with like a gigabyte of data versus the terabyte of data you thought you're going to deal with. And these things, the more you know up front about the requirements, the better off you can start using different strategies when it comes to agentic coding. And I'm sure you can use your imagination to figure out where stuff is well defined. And other times you're working on something, you have to go back and forth with your product owner or like your UX person, and you keep on tweaking things to try to make it better or like add padding, add spacing if it's a UI thing. So how do these requirements come into play with agentic coding? Well, there's two main strategies I have basically done with agentic coding all the time. The first one, if you have a good understanding and well-defined requirements, you should probably always use some type of plan mode. And I'm hoping this is obvious for many people, but I would always just take the requirements, throw as much context into the plan mode as possible, and then kick off the plan mode, and then you actually want to iterate on it. So I'm going to say iterate multiple times. I will read through that plan. I will glance through, make sure that every edge case is kind of covered. I will ask questions. So sometimes you just ask questions against the plan mode and it starts uncovering things that it didn't necessarily plan out from the get-go. And the more business domain expertise you have in your project or code base, the better questions you can ask, which means that the iteration becomes better over time. And then finally, you can actually just implement the plan. Now, often I would say that depending on how large the thing is, I will do like 1 to 5 iterations to make sure that the plan is actually really solid. Now, even with this approach, I will say that there is like 5 to 20%. It really depends on the model and the complexity of the task you're trying to do, where it's going to miss stuff. So it's going to miss requirements. It's going to add bad code. You have to go back through and you have to iterate and tweak stuff. But for that 80%, I think this type of approach works really good. And for the remainder, you can then keep on tagging context and trying to get it to hone in on exactly getting it to work correctly. You can add in guardrails like test-driven development or add in Cypress tests or something to make sure that when the model is trying to implement, you can tell it to test along the way so you have better control over the outputs of your LLM. But overall, I've been doing this a lot at work, especially on professional projects where typically you have a team of people who really understand what needs to be built, and they will plan out exactly with like bullet points of it needs to do this, that, and the other, and you need to be this user role. It shouldn't work for these other user roles. The more requirements you have up front, I think the better this type of approach works. Now let's move over to the uncertainty of requirements. So this, again, like I mentioned, the game, or if you're trying to rapidly prototype a user experience, some good examples of this is I'll get into a Zoom with coworkers and I'll have like a user experience person just sharing my screen. I'll share my screen and we'll actually just keep on prompting. We'll just do prompt after prompt after prompt, trying to improve a form, trying to improve a page, trying to add validation that might be missing, or try to tweak colors or whatnot. I found this to be a very, very good pattern as well. If you can actually do pair programming or kind of like group together with a team of like one or two other individuals, maybe someone's a UX person, maybe you have a product owner in the Zoom with you and you are the coder, prompting as they basically tell you what to do. You're the one who's an expert at kind of controlling these LLMs to get the job done, but you need that additional context that they have domain level experience or knowledge with that they can give to you. Now, the way this changes with agentic coding is typically I'll just prompt. I'll just continue to prompt. So for example, I'll go and describe it, hey, on this certain page, we need it to do this. And then with that context window, I will just keep on prompting and prompting and prompting, right? So this might be very obvious too, but like I'm not sitting there and trying to create an MD file that has like everything documented out. We are on the fly. People will say stuff like, hey, I noticed that the spacing between this is a little tight. I will literally just go over to another agent and just say, hey, can you please increase the spacing of my bottom hot menu for the items just so the text is not overlapping. And then I'll kick that off and I'll go back and we'll start talking and looking through the UI, play testing. And as people find things or point things out, I can then just keep kicking those things off into prompts, right? So that's kind of like on my professional experience of me working with a team of people. That's how we kind of iterate with this approach to agentic coding where you don't have certain requirements, or the requirements are kind of inside the head of someone else. And it's actually faster, instead of them like writing out everything into an MD file, just get them into a Zoom with you and just like iterate and prototype on something. Now, I've also do this all the time on my side projects for smaller scale projects where, for example, this game or like other SaaS products I've been kind of experimenting with. I don't really 100% know where stuff's going to go. So sometimes, for example, this game used to be a wave-based game where people would basically try to build in the center of the map. And I decided to pivot on that. So there's a lot of things I've been kind of changing. For example, I have one giant world map. So we have a map editor over here where I can come through and kind of play out the map. And the way this iterative approach works is if I'm using this editor and I notice that something is not what I need to be more efficient at building out the map, for example, it's kind of laggy, that's something I'd probably go over and I'd start prompting to get it fixed up. And then as I'm playing the game, I may notice that there's some things that don't really work too well. Like I can't, for some reason, change my weapons over here. I'll just go ahead and kick off another agent window and prompt that. So it's a very different approach to doing agentic coding, where instead of like sitting down with pen and paper and planning everything out in an MD file, I'm like on the fly, I'm improving the quality of my game, improving the user experience of my game, making it more enjoyable, and then just throwing stuff away if the change I just added doesn't really improve the end goal or vision that I'm shooting for. Now, the one thing I will say is that sometimes you can do a bunch of this rapid experimentation and prototyping to kind of get a feel for something. And then once you know that you have a certain path you want to take, you can just stash everything and kind of pivot back to the well-known requirements because you figured out exactly how your game needs to work. And then you can do a more verbose plan mode and make sure that it really figures out and adds in everything. Because typically you're going to get better code quality if it's all kind of done in one plan mode versus like, this iteration over iteration. Sometimes you start adding more slop into your code base. So that's another approach too, is you can start with this uncertainty of requirements, try to find the actual well-known requirements, and then you throw it all away and start over with the plan mode. That's something that I've been kind of doing as well. But I wanted to share that with you all just in case it's not really obvious of the two different approaches. And then of course, the complexity of the problem, maybe you have to kind of sit somewhere in the middle where you don't know everything and you can start asking questions, but sometimes some questions cannot be answered until you start building it out and testing it for yourself. So hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good day and happy coding.